In August 1775, 96 men walked nearly 500 miles in 21 days. They arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, sunburned and barefoot, carrying handmade rifles that nobody in New England had ever seen before. Within 48 hours, they killed their first British soldier at a range the British thought was impossible. American officers claimed they killed dozens more in the weeks that followed, claims the British disputed but could not entirely refute. And throughout the autumn that followed their arrival, the church bells of Boston that had stopped tolling for military funerals after Bunker Hill remained silent. The British command kept them that way. There were too many funerals already. The riflemen were going to make sure there were more. There were fewer than 1,500 of them. They faced the most professional army in the world. They were outnumbered, outgunned, outsupplied, and outclassed in every conventional measure of 18th century warfare. And before the siege ended, they would terrify that army, embarrass that army on 2 continents, and very nearly destroy the American army they were supposed to be saving. A London newspaper would call them the most fatal widow and orphan makers in the world. The British called them shirt-tail men. Washington called them necessary. And then, in private, he called them something else entirely. This is the story of how the United States Army was born, and how the men who built it almost broke it. This is not the story you have been told. This is not Lexington. This is not Concord. This is not the shot heard round the world. This is what happened after. When an army that did not yet exist learned what it would have to become to win a war it was not ready to fight. And it learned that lesson from the men least suited to teach it. Sometimes the weapon that wins a war is not the one that kills the most enemies. Sometimes it is the one that makes them afraid of the dark. Sometimes the most dangerous men on a battlefield are the ones who refuse to behave like soldiers. And sometimes the army that wins is the one that finds a way to use those men without being destroyed by them. This is that story. By the end of this video, you will understand how a few hundred frontier hunters with one-shot rifles terrified an army that could fire 4 times faster than they could. You will understand why the church bells of Boston, already silenced after Bunker Hill, were never allowed to ring again for the British officers the riflemen killed all autumn long. You will hear about a prisoner paraded through England as a specimen of the rebel marksman, and how he broke British morale instead of building it, then escaped with intelligence that changed the war. You will see the mutiny that nearly destroyed the Continental Army in its first 90 days. You will see Washington personally ride out, accompanied by 2 generals, to face down armed men of his own command on a hillside near Cambridge. And you will understand why the man who recruited them privately wished they had never come. You will see the exact moment that the myth grew bigger than the weapon. You will see the British counter that finally neutralized them. And you will see the lesson that every modern light infantry doctrine still teaches. A lesson written, for the first time, in the fields and trenches around Boston in the bitter winter of 1775. These men were not soldiers. They were hunters who learned to fight an empire. They changed warfare not by what they did, but by what their enemies believed they could do. The truth was smaller than the legend. The legend was bigger than the war. Hit that subscribe button. Let us step into Boston, 1775. The battlefield is not a battlefield. It is a city on a peninsula, surrounded by water, connected to the mainland by 2 thin strips of land called Boston Neck and Charlestown Neck. The city is Boston. The date is April 19th, 1775. Lexington and Concord have already burned. The countryside is in arms. Word has spread by horseback and by drum that the British have fired on Americans. that Americans have fired back, and that the rebellion everyone has been talking about for 10 years is no longer a rumor. It has arrived. By nightfall on the 19th, militia from every town within 50 miles are converging on Boston. By the next morning, more arrive from further out. Within a week, militia from across New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire have poured into the camps outside the city. Farmers, blacksmiths, tradesmen, lawyers, apprentices, old men who remember the French wars, boys who have never fired a shot in anger. 20,000 of them, by some estimates, sealing off the 2 necks of land, watching the British, waiting. They have done something extraordinary. They have besieged a regular army. Inside Boston, 3,000 of the finest soldiers in the world, British regulars under General Thomas Gage, are trapped. They cannot move overland without going through the Americans. They can only be resupplied by sea. The city itself, full of loyal civilians, hostile civilians, and confused civilians, is a powder keg of competing loyalties. The Americans have done the impossible, and they cannot finish what they started. This is the part nobody puts in the patriotic paintings. The American forces outside Boston have no heavy artillery. They have a few light field guns. They have nothing that can breach the British defenses. They have no engineers worth speaking of. They have no system for moving supplies. They have no system for feeding 20,000 men in tents through a New England summer that becomes a New England autumn that will become a New England winter. They have no medical service. They have no hospital. They have no uniform. They have no flag. They have, in the most literal sense, no army. They have a mob with rifles and a grudge. Dysentery moves through the camps like a second invasion. Smallpox arrives next. The hygiene is so catastrophic that the Massachusetts Provincial Congress sends a formal warning about the lack of military discipline and standard sanitation. Men relieve themselves wherever they happen to be standing. Latrines, where they exist, are dug too close to the wells. The water becomes contaminated within weeks. Whole companies are reduced to half strength, not by British bullets, but by their own filth. The men come and go as they please. Their enlistments are short, measured in weeks, sometimes in days. They argue endlessly about rank. They elect their own officers in many cases, which means the officers have to court the men's favor to maintain authority. There is no national chain of command because there is no nation. The men from Connecticut do not consider themselves subordinate to officers from Massachusetts. The men from New Hampshire do not consider themselves subordinate to anyone. And then there is the ammunition. On August 1st, 1775, Elbridge Gerry, chairman of the Committee of Supply of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, writes a letter to General Washington. The letter contains a single number that should have ended the American Revolution before it had properly begun. The entire army besieging Boston, Gerry reports, possesses 36 barrels of gunpowder. 36 for nearly 20,000 men. After accounting for the powder needed to fire artillery, that meant roughly 9 cartridges per soldier. 9 shots. That is what stood between the Continental Army and extinction. If the British had known, if General Gage, sitting in Boston with his disciplined regiments and his naval support and his stockpiled ammunition, had understood how close the army outside his walls was to having nothing left to fire, he could have walked out of the city. He could have ordered a full sortie. He could have ended the rebellion in an afternoon. The American line would have collapsed. The militia would have melted back into their farms. The Second Continental Congress would have been negotiating terms by autumn. He did not know. And that gap, that single piece of British ignorance, is the only reason this story continues. Washington kept the powder shortage secret with a discipline that bordered on obsession. He wrote letters in code. He routed messages through trusted couriers only. He refused to put the true figure on paper unless absolutely necessary. The number of people who knew the army was almost out of powder could be counted on a man's hands. Everyone else, including most of his own officers, believed the supply was adequate. It was not adequate. It was almost nothing. When George Washington arrives in Cambridge on July 3, 1775, to formally take command of what Congress has decided to call the Continental Army, this is the situation he inherits. A besieging force that cannot maintain its own siege. A coalition of provincial militias that does not believe in coalitions. An ammunition supply that would not last a single serious engagement. And an officer corps split between regional jealousies, personal ambitions, and the slow recognition that none of them know how to do what they are now being asked to do. Washington is 43 years old. He has commanded militia in the French and Indian War, but he has never commanded a force this large. He has never commanded a force this disorganized. He has never commanded a force whose primary characteristics are that it does not exist yet, and that it is at war with the British Empire. He understands immediately that this cannot hold. The British will eventually move. They have to. They cannot remain bottled in Boston forever. When they do move, when they finally push out from the city in force, the patchwork of provincial regiments will not survive the first serious push. Washington needs something else. He needs troops who can fight. He needs troops who can hold the line when the regulars come. He needs troops who can do something the New England militia, for all its enthusiasm, has shown it cannot do, which is stand and deliver against trained infantry on open ground. He needs professional soldiers in an army that has never produced any, and he is about to receive the worst possible solution to that problem. The decision was already made before Washington reached Cambridge. It had been made, in fact, 3 weeks earlier by men sitting in Philadelphia who had never seen the camps outside Boston and could not have imagined the state they were in. On June 14, 1775, 3 weeks before Washington took command, the Second Continental Congress passed a resolution. They authorized the recruitment of 10 companies of expert riflemen from the backcountry frontiers of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. 6 from Pennsylvania, 2 from Maryland, 2 from Virginia, each company to consist of approximately 68 men plus officers. Each company to march to Cambridge as quickly as possible. Each company to serve for 1 year. This resolution is the legal birth of the United States Army. The very first sentence of America's military history is a request for hunters. That phrasing matters. Congress did not ask for soldiers. It asked for riflemen. It asked specifically for men who already knew how to shoot at distances most New Englanders could not even comprehend. It asked for men from the frontier, from the long contested edge of European settlement where firearms were not parade equipment but tools for survival. Tools used daily. Tools used against bears and deer and the occasional Native American war party. Tools that, in the hands of the right men, could do things no smoothbore musket on earth could do. The men who answered were not what New England expected. They came from the Scots-Irish settlements of the Shenandoah Valley in what is now Western Virginia. Their grandfathers had crossed from Ulster. Their fathers had fought the French. They themselves had grown up on the frontier, which in 1775 meant a strip of land, perhaps 100 miles wide, where every farm was a potential battleground, and every man, woman, and child knew how to load a rifle. They came from the German farms of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where the gunsmithing tradition stretched back to the Palatinate, and where the long rifle itself had been invented. They came from the wild edges of Maryland and Virginia, where the closest neighbor might be 20 miles away, and where every man carried his own rifle because there was no one else to do the shooting if something went wrong. They were independent in a way that nobody in New England was independent. They were not citizens of any particular town. They were not members of any particular church. They were not subordinate to any particular landlord or magistrate. They had been raising themselves on the frontier for 2 and sometimes 3 generations. They knew how to live in the woods. They knew how to fight in the woods. They knew how to die in the woods. They had a deep, instinctive contempt for any authority that they had not personally chosen, and a deeper contempt for the kind of European-style discipline that asked them to stand in straight lines while being shot at. They were exactly the men Congress had asked for, and they were going to be a problem. The speed of their mobilization remains, 2.5 centuries later, almost impossible to comprehend. Captain Daniel Morgan was 39 years old in the summer of 1775. He was a Virginian by adoption, born in New Jersey, moved south as a young man. With a face that carried the scar of a French and Indian War musket ball that had passed through his cheek and taken several teeth on its way out. He was a teamster, a farmer, a brawler, and a born commander. He had been an officer in the militia for years. When Congress's call reached Winchester, Virginia, in mid-June, Morgan began recruiting immediately. He needed 68 men. He got 96 volunteers in less than 10 days. He turned away dozens more. He gave the men 3 days to settle their affairs. Then, on July 14th, 1775, he started walking, roughly 600 miles, by the figure that has come down through tradition and Dar monuments, closer to 484 miles by the most careful modern reconstruction. Either way, the distance from Winchester, Virginia to Cambridge, Massachusetts was, in 1775, a journey of weeks for a single rider on a fresh horse who could change mounts at every tavern. For an organized company of 96 men, carrying rifles, packs, ammunition, food, blankets, and personal kit, moving on foot, sleeping under the stars, fording rivers, crossing mountains. It should have taken a month and a half, maybe 2 months, probably longer, given that the route ran through Pennsylvania and across New York during the height of summer. Morgan's company covered it in 21 days. 21 days. Just under 30 miles a day, every day, for 3 weeks straight. They walked through Pennsylvania. They walked through New Jersey. They walked across the Hudson. They walked through Connecticut. They walked into Massachusetts. They arrived in Cambridge on August 6th, 1775. They had not lost a single man. When historians use the phrase beeline march, they are reaching for a description of something that should not have been possible. Morgan's men moved with the directness and stamina of bees returning to a hive. They did not stop. They did not detour. They did not lose stragglers. They marched in the heat. They marched in the rain. They marched at a pace that broke ordinary infantry companies. And they were not the only ones. A rival company under Captain Hugh Stevenson, 98 men by some counts, left from Morgan's Spring, near Shepherdstown in what is now West Virginia, 2 days behind Morgan. There was, in fact, an unofficial race. The 2 companies had agreed to rendezvous at Frederick, Maryland, and march together to Boston. Morgan did not wait. He stole a day's march. Stevenson's men, arriving at Frederick to find their rivals already gone, set off in pursuit, marching at times 30 miles a day in an attempt to overtake them. They never did. Stevenson reached Cambridge on August 11th, 1775, 5 days behind Morgan. His company had made the same journey in 24 or 25 days, depending on the source. 5 days behind. after nearly 500 miles, on foot with rifles and packs, in a foot race nobody had ever attempted before. That was the difference between glory and second place. By the end of August, the full Pennsylvania Rifle Battalion under Colonel William Thompson, 8 companies, several hundred men, had also arrived. The Maryland companies under Captain Michael Cresap and Captain Thomas Price had reached Cambridge on August 9th. The full rifle establishment, what Congress had authorized in June, was on the lines outside Boston within 10 weeks of the order being signed. In an age of slow communication and slower armies, this was unprecedented. The Continental Army's first specialized force had assembled itself across hundreds of miles of bad roads, mountains, and contested countryside in less time than it took most European armies to issue boots. And they looked nothing like soldiers. Washington's New England officers watched them march into Cambridge with something close to disbelief. Where were the uniforms? Where were the muskets? Where were the bayonets? Where were the cocked hats and the white crossbelts and the polished buttons that every European army for a century had used to mark out who was a soldier and who was not? These men wore long hunting shirts of linen, fringed at the seams, dyed in shades of off-white and brown, and pale yellow and dirty green. They wore buckskin leggings, leather pants essentially, sewn close to the leg. They wore moccasins. Many wore round felt hats instead of cocked tricorns. They carried tomahawks at their belts. Some carried scalping knives. Their rifles were longer than any musket the New Englanders had ever seen, but slimmer, with elegant curving stocks of curly maple and brass patch boxes worked into the wood. To the New Englanders, who had spent the previous 3 months trying very hard to look like a proper European army, even when they were not behaving like one, the riflemen looked like Indians. The frontier dress was so far outside European military convention that some New England soldiers initially mistook approaching rifle companies for Native American war parties and nearly fired on them. To the British across the lines in Boston, watching with telescopes, they looked like something stranger. They looked like the forest itself had learned to walk. They looked like the wild country beyond the Hudson, the country no British officer had ever fully mapped. The country that had swallowed Braddock's army 20 years earlier, the country where rules did not apply, had sent ambassadors. The first British impression was contempt. These were not soldiers. These were rabble. The second impression came on August 8th. The third impression was the one that lasted. To understand what these men carried, you have to understand what every other soldier in the war was carrying, and why that difference is not a technical footnote. It is the entire story. The standard infantry weapon of the British Army in 1775 was the land pattern musket. Soldiers called it the Brown Bess. There were 2 versions in service, the long land pattern with a 46-inch barrel and the newer short land pattern with a 42-inch barrel. But the differences for our purposes are minor. Both were flintlocks. Both were smoothbores. Both fired a lead ball roughly 3/4 of an inch in diameter, a .75 caliber in modern terms, which is enormous. A Brown Bess ball that struck a man anywhere in the torso did not wound him. It destroyed him. It shattered bone. It tore through organs. It left exit wounds the size of a child's fist. But hitting a man with a Brown Bess was a different problem entirely. The barrel was hollow inside. No rifling, no spiral grooves. Nothing to spin the ball as it left the muzzle. The ball itself was loose, significantly smaller than the bore. And this looseness was not a defect. It was a feature. It was the entire design philosophy of the weapon. The gap between the ball and the inside wall of the barrel is called windage. Windage allowed soldiers to load fast. You bit open a paper cartridge. You poured the powder down the barrel. You crammed the ball and the wadded paper down on top of it. You rammed it twice. You primed the pan. You cocked the lock. You fired. A trained British regular could complete that sequence in roughly 15 seconds. 3 shots a minute. 4 if he was excellent. 5 if he was a freak of nature and not under fire. In exchange for that loading speed, the Brown Bess gave up almost everything else. The loose ball did not fly straight. It bounced off the inside of the barrel on its way out. It exited at an unpredictable angle. It yawed and tumbled in flight, sometimes catching the air sideways. Beyond 50 yards, hitting a specific man was essentially impossible. Beyond 100 yards, hitting a specific unit was difficult. Beyond 150 yards, the ball was traveling on a curve so steep and so unpredictable that you might as well have been throwing rocks. This is why 18th century European armies fought the way they did, shoulder to shoulder in massed lines 2 and 3 ranks deep, firing volleys at other massed lines at point-blank range. It was not stupidity. It was not parade ground vanity. It was the mathematics of an inaccurate weapon. You concentrated fire because individual aim was meaningless. You stood close together because that was the only way to deliver enough lead into a small enough space to hit anything. You walked toward the enemy in formation because formation discipline was the only thing that allowed an army to keep firing after the first volley. And when the firing was over, you finished the job with steel. Because the second great advantage of the Brown Bess was that it mounted a bayonet, a 17-inch triangular socket bayonet designed to fit over the muzzle and lock into place. With bayonets fixed, a British line became a hedge of moving steel. A regiment advancing in line with fixed bayonets at the steady measured pace 18th century drill manuals prescribed was the single most decisive infantry weapon of the entire century. Once the shooting was over, the bayonets decided who held the field. This was the system. This was European warfare in 1775. This was what the British Army did better than anyone else in the world. The American long rifle was the opposite of all of this. It was built by German immigrant gunsmiths in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and the surrounding towns, places like Lebanon and Reading and Bethlehem and York. The tradition stretched back to the German Jaeger rifle of the early 18th century. But in Pennsylvania, the design had been adapted to American conditions over 50 years of frontier use. The result was something distinctively American: longer, slimmer, more elegant, and far more accurate than its European ancestors. Modern collectors call it the Pennsylvania long rifle, or sometimes the Kentucky rifle, though almost none of them were actually made in Kentucky. They were made in Pennsylvania, and they were carried west. Each one was handmade. Each one took a master gunsmith weeks to build. The barrel was forged from iron, bored to the desired diameter, and then cut on the inside with spiral grooves, rifling, using a cutting tool drawn slowly down the bore by hand. Typically 4 to 8 grooves, depending on the smith, with a slow twist rate of 1 turn in every 48 to 60 inches. That slow twist was the key. It was perfectly optimized to spin stabilize a round lead ball at the velocities produced by 18th century black powder. The ball was undersized, typically between 36 and 50 caliber, much smaller than the Brown Bess's 75. But the ball was not loaded loose. The ball was wrapped in a greased linen patch, set on the muzzle, and forced down the barrel with a ramrod. The patch gripped the rifling. When the powder ignited, the patched ball did not slide loose down the barrel. It bit into the grooves and rotated as the rifling drove it down the bore. By the time it left the muzzle, it was spinning on its longitudinal axis at thousands of revolutions per minute. A spinning ball flies straight. A spinning ball does not yaw. A spinning ball does not tumble. A spinning ball, in the hands of a man who knows what he is doing, will hit what he is aiming at. And the rifle was built to be aimed. It had real sights, a front blade or post near the muzzle, and a rear notch near the breech, set far apart along that long barrel. The longer the sight radius, the more precisely the shooter could align the weapon on a target. The Brown Bess had rudimentary sights, or sometimes none at all, because there was no point in giving precise sights to an imprecise weapon. The long rifle had sights worthy of the name, because the weapon itself was worth aiming. British Colonel George Hanger, who would later face these weapons in the southern campaigns of the war, wrote about them with the grudging admiration of a professional soldier confronted by a tool he could not match. The Lancaster-made rifles, he recorded, had barrels exactly 3 feet 3 inches long, 39 inches, weighing approximately 6 pounds, carrying a ball of 36 to the pound. That is the technical language of an officer who has measured and weighed these weapons himself, presumably from captured examples. Hanger's most quoted line, the one military historians have been repeating for 2 centuries, is this: "To hit a target at 200 yards with a common smoothbore musket," he wrote, "was equivalent to firing at the moon." A rifleman at 200 yards could reliably strike a target the size of a human head. 200 yards. That is the length of 2 American football fields, end to end. That is a range at which a smoothbore armed soldier is not even meaningfully aware he is in danger. He cannot see individual faces at that distance. He cannot hear orders shouted from there. He certainly cannot be hit by anything fired at him from there. From 200 yards, the smoothbore soldier is, for all practical purposes, beyond the war. That is the range at which the American rifleman kills him. And the rifle could do more than 200 yards. 300 yards, in expert hands, was a realistic shot. 400 yards was possible. There is a documented incident years later, in 1780, at White's Mill on Fishing Creek in South Carolina. Colonel George Hanger himself and Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, 2 of the most feared British officers in the Southern theater of the war, were standing in an open field on a mill dam, surveying the ground. They were exactly 400 yards from the American lines. They believed they were safely beyond effective rifle range. A single American rifleman lay down on his belly. He took aim. He fired 1 shot. The ball passed between Hanger and Tarleton. Neither man was touched, but the bugler's horse, standing directly behind them, meaning the ball had to pass between the 2 senior officers to reach it, was killed instantly. Hanger remembered that shot for the rest of his life. He wrote about it. He used it as the basis for everything he subsequently said about the long rifle. He understood, in the moment that horse went down, that he and Tarleton had survived a coordinated act of will from an American shooter 400 yards away who had decided which of them to spare. The decision had not been his. The decision had been the rifleman's. That was new. That was the future of warfare announcing itself in the death of a horse. But the rifle had costs, brutal costs. It loaded slowly in a way that is hard to overstate. To load a long rifle, the shooter had to measure loose black powder from a powder horn into a small charge cup, pour it down the barrel, place a pre-cut greased patch over the muzzle, center a ball on the patch, and then ram the patched ball down the entire length of the barrel using force. Real force. The whole point of the rifle was that the patch and ball gripped the rifling so tightly the rotation could be imparted. That tight grip meant that loading required physical effort. The rammer was a heavy steel rod. The shooter often had to brace the rifle butt against the ground and lean his weight onto the rammer. In the standing position, under battlefield stress, the process took 90 seconds. The best riflemen managed 2 shots per minute. Most managed 1. Some, with fouled barrels, managed less. That is the asymmetry that defined every rifleman's life on every battlefield he ever stood on. A British regular fires 4 shots in the time it takes a rifleman to fire 1. A British regular's reload is a sequence of motions trained until it is reflex: bite, pour, ram, prime, cock. A rifleman's reload is a sequence of decisions: measure the charge, set the patch, seat the ball, ram it down with controlled force. Under fire, with hands shaking and breath short and the smell of burnt powder making your eyes water, those decisions take time. And a line of British regulars closing the distance can cover 150 yards in less than 60 seconds at the trot. If the rifleman misses his first shot or hits but does not stop the line, he does not get a second. And he has no bayonet. The long rifle's barrel was not built to mount a socket bayonet. The exterior of the muzzle was tapered slightly, the iron was thin compared to a musket barrel, and there was no standardized fitting because every rifle was handmade and every rifle was different. You could not equip a rifle company with a uniform issue of bayonets because there was nothing uniform on the weapons to attach them to. So when the rifleman had fired his shot and not reloaded, and the British line was 50 yards away and closing at the run with 18 inches of triangular steel fixed to the end of every musket, he had a hunting knife. He had a tomahawk. He had his hands. That was all. These were the men George Washington had been sent to defend his army with. A weapon that could kill at 300 yards. A weapon that was useless at 30. The men who carried it knew exactly what they had. They knew the rifle's range, and they knew its limits. They understood, in a way the New England militia could not have understood, that their entire combat value depended on choosing where and when to fight. On open ground, in formation, against bayonets, they were dead. In the woods, behind a rail fence, from a hilltop, picking targets at 200 yards while the enemy could not even see them. They were the most dangerous men in the American Army. And the British were about to learn it. The riflemen did not wait. They did not drill. They did not train with the rest of the army. They did not stand in long ranks practicing the manual of arms while sergeants screamed at them in the New England summer heat. They were deployed within days of arrival to the forward American positions. Prospect Hill, Plowed Hill, the Roxbury lines, the places where the two armies faced each other most closely. And they began to do what they had come hundreds of miles to do. On August 8, 1775, the very day 3 Pennsylvania companies reached Cambridge, they killed a British sentry. The first action of the riflemen in the war was not a drill, not a parade, not a review. It was a kill. A man standing his post on the Boston Neck Redoubt, doing what sentries do, became the first British soldier to die at the hands of the new army Congress had just invented. He would not be the last. He would not even be the last that week. By August 13th, just 5 days later, Captain James Chambers of the Pennsylvania Rifle Battalion was claiming, in a report whose accuracy historians have argued about ever since, that his riflemen had killed 42 British soldiers and taken 38 prisoners, including 4 captains. The numbers were almost certainly inflated. They were also reported, repeated, and believed. Whatever the true count, the riflemen were doing something the New England militia had not been able to do in 3 months of close siege. They were killing British soldiers steadily, at long range, day after day, in numbers that the American camps could brag about and the British camps could not deny. These were not lucky shots. These were not lucky days. This was sustained, methodical, daily marksmanship at distances the British did not yet understand were dangerous. The killing rate was unlike anything the British had seen in their entire careers. Soldiers fell who had not believed themselves in range. Officers fell who had been certain they were safe. Sentries fell at their posts. Messengers fell on the roads. Foragers fell in the fields. Men fell while drinking from streams. Men fell while squatting at latrines. Men fell while sleeping. The riflemen, working in pairs and small teams, crept forward at dawn and at dusk and sometimes in full daylight, found firing positions in the broken ground between the lines, picked their targets, and shot them. The British response was at first disbelief. Then disbelief became anger. Then anger became fear. The targeting was deliberate. The riflemen were not shooting at random redcoats. They were shooting at officers. They were shooting at sergeants. They were shooting at any man whose uniform, posture, or position marked him as someone whose death would cost the British more than just one soldier. In the British Army of 1775, an officer's death was not a statistical event. It was a command crisis. Junior officers had to be promoted to replace senior ones. Discipline within a company depended on the presence of its captain. The chain of command, the entire machinery of 18th century warfare, ran through specific individuals whose faces and uniforms were instantly recognizable on a battlefield. And the riflemen knew this. They had figured it out within days. They started killing officers preferentially, and they did it at ranges that left the British command structure with no defense. British Major George Hanger, writing later, described what the rifle could do to a single rider on a horse at extended range. A rifleman lying prone, flat on his belly, the most stable shooting position there is, could target individual horsemen at 400 yards. Hanger had seen it himself. He had survived it himself. He knew the weapon's capabilities not from rumor, but from having had a horse shot dead behind him by a man 400 yards away who had chosen, in the moment of trigger pull, not to kill him. In Boston, the cumulative effect on the garrison's officer corps was severe. Captains and lieutenants began to die at a rate the British Army's replacement system struggled to keep pace with. The exact casualty numbers from riflemen fired during the siege have been disputed by historians for 2 centuries. American reports almost certainly inflated them. British reports almost certainly minimized them. But the qualitative effect is not in dispute. Officers died who had not believed themselves in range. The deaths kept coming, every day, every patrol, every careless moment at a window or a parapet. The British in Boston already knew what it sounded like when their funerals were silent. After the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, 2 months before the first riflemen arrived in Cambridge, General Thomas Gage had been forced to suspend a tradition that stretched back generations. British military funerals were traditionally marked by the tolling of church bells. The bells of the nearest church would ring out across the town as the procession passed. But Bunker Hill had killed and wounded over 1,000 British soldiers in a single afternoon. The casualty rolls were so long that if the bells had been allowed to ring for every funeral, they would have rung continuously, day and night, for weeks. The merchant William Cheever recorded the suspension in his diary. The bells went silent. Gage's order was practical. It was also, in a way Gage did not yet fully grasp, a confession. When the riflemen arrived in August, the bells were already silent. They stayed silent. They had to. The autumn killing campaign, the snipers in the broken ground between the lines, the dead sentries, the officers picked off at distances that should have been safe, meant that the order Gage had given for one reason in June became impossible to rescind for another reason by October. To start ringing the bells again would have meant admitting how many British officers were dying. keep them silent meant pretending the deaths were not happening. Either way, the Riflemen had ensured that the bells of Boston, which had stopped tolling for the dead of Bunker Hill, would not toll for the dead of the long autumn that followed. This is one of the quieter and more telling details of the entire siege. The most professional army in the world, occupying the most important city in the American colonies, conducted its officers' funerals in silence for 11 months, because the death toll was beyond what its ceremonial traditions could absorb. The Riflemen did not invent that silence. They inherited it from Bunker Hill, but they made sure it lasted. The funerals continued. The killing did not stop. Now, the actual numbers tell a more complicated story. The Riflemen could not have killed as many British soldiers as the most enthusiastic American reports claimed. Captain Chambers's count of 42 kills in 5 days was almost certainly inflated. British casualty records from the siege do not support the most extreme American figures. But here is what military historians have come to understand about the Rifleman campaign in Boston. The real casualty count, whatever it was, mattered far less than the perceived casualty count. The Riflemen killed enough men. They killed the right men. And they killed in a way that made every British soldier in Boston feel personally targeted every time he stepped outside. That was the point. That had always been the point. Because the Rifleman's most devastating weapon was not actually the rifle. It was the rumor of the rifle. The British called them shirt-tail men, sometimes shirtmen. The terms were derived from the fringed linen hunting shirts the Riflemen wore. Long shirts that hung loose past the waist, fringed at the seams and the cuffs, often dyed in earth tones or left in natural off-white. The British saw the shirts as evidence of savagery. The shirts were not uniforms. The shirts were not British. The shirts were, in the minds of regulars raised on the European tradition, the dress of irregulars, and irregulars, in 18th century British military thought, were a category that included Native American warriors, French-Canadian coureurs des bois, and the various other forest-dwelling enemies who had been bleeding British regulars for half a century in North America. The Riflemen looked to the British like Indians. The fact that almost all of them were of European descent did not matter. What mattered was the shirt. What mattered was the tomahawk at the belt. What mattered was the scalping knife. What mattered was that these men did not fight like Europeans, and did not look like Europeans, and did not behave like Europeans. And the only frame of reference the British had for that combination was the most feared category of enemy in their entire colonial experience. A London newspaper in 1775 published a warning to its readers about the new American force. The phrase has come down through history. The shirt-tail men, the paper called them, with their cursed, twisted guns, the most fatal widow and orphan makers in the world. Cursed, twisted guns. That was the rifling, the spiral grooves that the British did not fully understand, and that they could only describe by what they could see, which was a barrel that had been somehow twisted on the inside. Widow and orphan makers. That was the targeting of officers, the killing of family men, the way the rifles destroyed not just soldiers, but the wives and children waiting for them in England. The phrase is so vivid, so quotable, so perfectly suited to American propaganda needs that some historians have suggested it may have originated not with a London newspaper, but with the American commander Benedict Arnold, in private correspondence praising Morgan's corps. The provenance is disputed. What is not disputed is that the phrase, wherever it came from, captured something real. The dread that engulfed the British garrison in Boston was not invented after the fact. It was reported in letters home. It was recorded in officers' journals. It was discussed in London by people who had never been to America and had no reason to fear an army of frontier hunters. The Riflemen had become a story that traveled faster than the truth about them. George Washington understood this immediately. He understood it long before his New England officers did, long before the British did, and possibly before the Riflemen themselves did. Washington had been a Virginian. He had grown up on the edges of the same frontier culture that produced the rifle companies. He knew exactly how the British Army viewed these men, and he knew exactly how to weaponize that view. In July 1776, 11 months after the rifle companies arrived at Cambridge, Washington issued a general order officially encouraging the adoption of the hunting shirt as army-wide dress. Across the entire Continental Army, men were ordered to wear the long-fringed linen shirts that had previously been the distinctive uniform of the rifle companies. Washington's stated reason was practical. The shirts were cheap, light, comfortable, and easy to produce. But buried in the order was a tactical reason that revealed Washington's deeper understanding of psychological warfare. The shirts, he wrote, carried no small terror to the enemy, who think every such person a complete marksman. Read that sentence twice. The commander of the Continental Army issued an order in 1776 telling his men to wear the hunting shirt because the enemy believed anyone wearing it was a deadly rifleman. The reality that most of the men putting on hunting shirts had never fired a rifle in their lives and were armed with the same standard muskets as the British did not matter. What mattered was that the British would believe. Every redcoat looking across a battlefield in 1776 and beyond would see hunting shirts and would feel in his stomach the dread he had learned to feel in Boston in 1775. He would not know whether the man in the shirt was a Lancaster County marksman who could hit his head at 200 yards or a Massachusetts farmer who could barely load his musket. He would assume the worst. He would aim worse. He would flinch. He would die. Washington made every American soldier into a rifleman by uniform, even when most of them were not riflemen at all. It was one of the most successful acts of psychological warfare in 18th century military history, and it worked because the riflemen had spent the autumn of 1775 establishing, at terrible cost to the British officer corps, that the hunting shirt meant death. But the most extraordinary single chapter in the psychological campaign was not fought in Cambridge. It was fought in England. In November 1775, during the subsequent American invasion of Canada, a campaign in which Morgan's Virginia Company was attached to Colonel Benedict Arnold's expedition, a young Virginian named George Merchant was captured. Merchant was a private in Morgan's company. He was, by Hanger's later description, a tall and handsome man, the kind of soldier who looked the part of a frontier marksman even when he was standing still. On the night of November 14th, 1775, the day after most of Arnold's detachment had crossed the St. Lawrence River, Merchant was stationed on sentry duty outside Quebec at a post that could not see the city's garrison, but could not see anyone approaching it either. A sergeant of the British 7th Regiment, with a few privates, crept through the bushes and sprung on him before he could cock his rifle. The British took him prisoner. They recognized immediately that they had captured something more than just a soldier. They had captured a specimen. The British shipped Merchant to England. Specifically, they shipped him in his original American kit. His hunting shirt, his leggings, his moccasins, his powder horn. They kept him dressed exactly as he had been when captured. The plan was to display him publicly across Britain. The plan was to show the British public what these famous American riflemen actually looked like. To expose the gap between the legend and the man. To demonstrate that the so-called shirt-tail terror was just a confused colonial in primitive clothing. To boost British recruitment by showing that the rebel army was not worth fearing. It did not work. Merchant was paraded through Bristol. He was displayed in other cities. He was, by some accounts, forced to give public marksmanship demonstrations, to fire his rifle in front of British crowds to prove or disprove the legends that had crossed the ocean. He proved them. The accuracy he displayed at British public exhibitions was so far beyond anything the average British civilian had ever seen with a firearm that the demonstrations had the exact opposite of their intended effect. Instead of stimulating recruitment, the public displays generated doubt. If this was an ordinary American rifleman, captured by chance on sentry duty, not even one of the elite, and this was what an ordinary American rifleman could do, then what were the rebels' best shooters capable of? What kind of war had Britain started? What kind of soldiers were British recruits being asked to face? The Merchant displays deepened domestic British skepticism about the war's viability. They became, by accident, one of the most effective pieces of American propaganda of the entire war, produced and distributed at British expense, on British soil, before a British audience. And then Merchant escaped. The exact details of his release remain murky in the records, but the broad outline is this. The British government, by 1776, had decided that holding Merchant was costing them more than releasing him. He was sent home, very liberally, in Hanger's phrase, and shipped to Halifax. From Halifax, with a few other escaped Americans, he made his way south in a small boat. He reached Maine. He delivered himself to American authorities at the town of York. He was carrying letters. Concealed in the waistband of his breeches, sewn into the lining, were documents he had been entrusted with by American agents in Europe. The letters were unsigned, but were believed to have come from Arthur Lee, the American diplomatic representative in London, dated February 13th and 14th, 1776. They contained copies of the treaties George III had concluded with the Duke of Brunswick, the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, and the Count of Hanau, the agreements to hire German mercenaries, commonly known as Hessians, to fight in America. Numbers, costs, timetables. The whole financial and political architecture of the Hessian deployment laid out in the treaty's own words. Merchant himself had not acquired the documents. He was the courier. He had been chosen, almost certainly, because his identity as a returning rifleman gave him cover. The British were unlikely to scrutinize too closely. He had carried Arthur Lee's intelligence across the Atlantic in his pants, walked off a small boat in Maine, and handed the war effort one of its most important diplomatic revelations. The intelligence reached the Continental Congress within weeks. Congress immediately published the contents. The revelation that Britain was hiring foreign mercenaries to fight Americans, that the war was being subcontracted to German soldiers because Britain itself could not or would not provide enough men, became one of the defining propaganda victories of the early war. It hardened colonial resolve. It convinced wavering moderates that reconciliation was no longer possible. It contributed directly to the political climate that produced the Declaration of Independence 6 months later. A single American rifleman, captured on sentry duty, paraded through England as proof of the rebel threat, had returned with intelligence that helped break the British war effort politically before it had truly begun militarily. This was the kind of thing the riflemen did, not always intentionally, not always by design, but consistently, at every level of the war, from the individual sentry kill on the Boston Neck to the international propaganda victory of the Hessian letters. They kept generating outcomes that exceeded their actual military capacity. They were a small force. They had a slow weapon. They could not hold ground against a serious bayonet charge. They were drunk and insubordinate and prone to feuding with the New England regiments. And the British were terrified of them. That was the contradiction. That was the whole story of the riflemen at Boston. They were less than they appeared to be, and more than they could account for. The myth was bigger than the weapon. The weapon was deadlier than the Army knew how to use. And underneath both myth and weapon, the men themselves were something nobody. Not Congress, not Washington, not the British, not even the riflemen fully understood. That was about to become a problem. The Boston siege was, for most of its 11 months, a war of small things. There was no Cannae here, no Yorktown, no single afternoon when armies met in the open and decided the outcome with steel and powder. There was only the long, grinding accumulation of skirmishes, patrols, foraging fights, and artillery exchanges that made up the daily reality of holding the lines. The riflemen's war was made of these small things. Individual shots, individual deaths, individual nights crawling forward through wet grass to a firing position 300 yards from a British sentry. But there were moments, 3 of them really, during the long autumn and winter of 1775, when the war stopped being small and the riflemen had to fight in something closer to a conventional engagement. Each one revealed something different about what they were and what they were not. The first was Plowed Hill. In the last days of August 1775, Washington decided to extend his lines. He ordered the fortification of Plowed Hill, a small rise between the existing American positions on Prospect Hill and the British positions on Bunker Hill, where the famous battle had been fought 2 months earlier. Holding Plowed Hill would bring American artillery within range of the British defenses on Charlestown Peninsula. It would tighten the noose. It would force a British response. The fortification work began on the night of August 26th. Engineers laid out the redoubt. Working parties began digging, and a detachment of 50 Pennsylvania riflemen was tasked with providing cover for the digging crews, keeping British patrols off the hill, suppressing any British attempt to interfere with the construction. The British saw the work being done at dawn on August 27th. They responded with everything they had within range. From the Charlestown batteries, captured at Bunker Hill, they opened a massive artillery bombardment. From the British warships in the harbor, naval guns joined the fire. Hours of sustained bombardment crashed onto the new American position. The riflemen, with no artillery of their own and no way to suppress British guns at that range, could only hold their positions, return fire when British infantry showed itself, and wait out the storm. Most of them survived the bombardment. One did not. His name was William Simpson. He was a volunteer from Paxton Township, Pennsylvania, serving in Captain Matthew Smith's Lancaster County Rifle Company. The details of the moment are sparse. A British cannonball struck him. The ball, likely a 6-pounder or 9-pounder solid shot, severed his leg. He was carried back to the American lines. He was taken to a field hospital, such as field hospitals existed in 1775. He was conscious enough to be visited by George Washington personally before he died. Washington came. The commander of the Continental Army left his headquarters and rode to the bedside of a private soldier from Pennsylvania, whose name he had not known a day earlier. He sat with Simpson. He spoke with him. The conversation has not survived in any record I have seen, but the fact of the visit has. Washington came to see him die. Simpson succumbed to his wound on August 28, 1775. He is recognized as the first official combat casualty of the newly authorized National Continental Army. This distinction matters, and it matters in a way that gets complicated quickly. There had been American combat deaths before Simpson. New England militia had been dying since April, since Lexington, since Concord. There had been the slaughter on Breed's Hill in June. There had been the Battle of Squantum in July, a small engagement on the Massachusetts coast in which a Private Nehemiah Clark of Colonel Joseph Reed's 20th Regiment was killed in action on July 12th, 1775. Clark had enlisted on May 8th. He had served his colony's regiment. He had died in his colony's service. But Clark was not a soldier of the Continental Army. He was a soldier of the Massachusetts Provincial Forces, which had been adopted into the Continental Army in name, but which still operated, in practice, as colony regiments serving under their own officers and their own regional command. The administrative line between provincial and continental was, in mid-1775, still being drawn. Many of the men in the camps outside Boston did not know whether they were soldiers of Massachusetts or of America or of both. The Continental Army existed on paper before it fully existed in practice. The rifle companies, however, were different. They had been recruited explicitly under the June 14th resolution. They had been raised as Continental troops from the start. They wore no provincial uniform because they were not provincial troops. They were the first units in American history to have been organized as national, federal forces from the moment of their enlistment. When Simpson died, he died as a soldier of the National Army, not of Pennsylvania, not of Massachusetts, not of any colony, of the United Colonies, soon to be the United States. He was the first man to be killed in combat under the new national authority that was, even in the moment of his death, still figuring out what it was. That is the meaning of the distinction. Clark died first. Simpson died as something new. Washington's visit to Simpson's bedside takes on a different weight in that light. The commander of the new National Army came to honor the first man to die in its service. It was not an empty gesture. It was a recognition that something had begun, something that would still be running in some form 2.5 centuries later. The second moment came in November. By early November 1775, the Riflemen had been on the lines for 3 months. The killing had continued. The British had adapted as much as they could, withdrawing officers from forward positions, ordering men to keep their heads down, suspending the bells, trying to maintain morale by sheer institutional inertia. But the British still needed food. The garrison was running short. The army inside Boston could not sustain itself indefinitely on what came in by sea. They needed forage. They needed fresh meat. They needed the cattle and sheep and grain that were scattered across the small islands and points of land in Boston Harbor and along the surrounding coast. On November 9th, 1775, the British went looking for it. A landing force, 9 companies of light infantry and 100 grenadiers, several hundred regulars in total, landed at Lechmere Point, a low-lying peninsula that became an island at high tide, separated from the mainland by a flooded marsh. The landing was covered by a British man-of-war and a floating battery. Their mission was to seize livestock and return to the city. It was a straightforward foraging operation, the kind British troops had been conducting for months. Washington's response was immediate. He ordered Colonel William Thompson to lead his Pennsylvania Rifle Battalion against the raiding party. Massachusetts regiments under Colonel Benjamin Woodbridge and Colonel John Patterson moved up in support. What happened next has the quality of a piece of cinema, even if the historical record disputes some of its details. Thompson's men reached the edge of the marsh, the swampy causeway separating Lechmere Point from the mainland, and discovered that the high tide had submerged it. Contemporary accounts describe 2 feet of icy water. Some say the men were in up to their armpits at the deepest stretches. It was November. The water was freezing. It was salt water, which carries the cold differently than fresh water and burns into wounds and cracks the skin. The crossing was over a quarter of a mile. Thompson did not hesitate. He gave the order. The Pennsylvania Rifle Battalion, joined by Colonel Thomas Mifflin and a small group of other officers, waded into the icy salt water, holding their rifles and powder above their heads, and pushed across the morass on foot. Men slipped under the surface and came up gasping. Men lost their footing on the muddy bottom. The cold drove into their bones in a way that would leave several of them sick for weeks afterward. But they crossed. When the riflemen emerged from the morass, soaked, freezing, mud-caked, but with their rifles dry, they were in firing position on the British rear. Thompson gave the signal. The battalion opened fire. The British did not panic. They did not break. They were professional regulars conducting a foraging operation under naval cover. And they did what professional regulars in that situation do. They completed their mission and then withdrew. The British seized 10 cattle. They drove them down to the boats. They embarked under covering fire from the warship, the floating battery, and the British guns on Charlestown Neck, firing grape shot across the marsh. The Americans, slowed by the causeway crossing and unable to close before the British re-embarked, could only pour aimed fire into the regulars as they made their orderly withdrawal. The casualty numbers from Lechmere Point have been disputed for 2.5 centuries. American accounts claimed 17 British dead and 1 wounded against 1 American killed and 3 wounded. The British reported far lower casualties. One early account from American officers themselves, citing a flag of truce sent the next day, mentions just 2 British dead. The truth lies somewhere in the middle and will probably never be settled. What is not disputed is that the British got their cattle. The foraging mission succeeded. They returned to Boston with 10 head of livestock and the awareness that the next time they landed on contested ground, the riflemen would be there. But the symbolic weight of Lechmere Point, the freezing morass, the waiting battalion, the riflemen emerging from a position the British had not expected, was out of all proportion to either the casualty count or the cattle count. Washington publicly commended Thompson and his men in his general orders the following day, praising the alacrity with which they had pushed through the water to reach the enemy. The action was reported across the colonies, sometimes embellished, often heroically retold. In American memory, Lechmere Point became a clean victory. In the British logbooks, it was a successful foraging raid that had encountered unexpected resistance. Both versions, in their own way, were true. Both versions, in their own way, were the riflemen's war in microcosm. The British achieved their tactical objective. The Americans achieved a propaganda victory. The cattle went to Boston. The story went everywhere else. The riflemen had a problem. The problem was that they were not soldiers. They had never been soldiers. They had been recruited 8 weeks earlier as marksmen. They had been welcomed in Cambridge as specialists. They had been excused by New England officers who believed they were dealing with an elite force from most of the routine duties of Army life. They did not dig trenches. They did not gather firewood. They did not stand standard camp guard rotations. They were camped apart from the main army at Prospect Hill, in their own lines, under their own officers, living more or less as they had lived on the frontier, communally, informally, with a deep contempt for anyone who tried to tell them what to do. This had seemed, in August, like a reasonable arrangement. By September, it was a disaster. The riflemen drank heavily. They drank in their tents. They drank on guard duty. They drank in the morning. They drank in the afternoon. They picked fights with New England regiments. They picked fights with each other. They insulted officers, not just New England officers, whom they regarded with open contempt, but their own officers, whom they regarded with somewhat less open contempt. They wandered out of camp without permission. They returned, when they returned, on their own schedule. On August 24th, a group of riflemen marched through Litchfield, Connecticut. Litchfield, which was nowhere near Boston, nowhere near where they were supposed to be, and forcibly broke a civilian out of the town jail. They did not return the civilian. They did not return themselves to the jurisdiction of the local authorities. They simply continued on their way, having decided that the laws of Connecticut did not apply to them. This was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern. The rifle companies operated in their own minds as a kind of armed federation of frontier communities that happened to be temporarily encamped near Boston. They acknowledged Congress because Congress was paying them. They acknowledged Washington because Washington was the commander. But they did not acknowledge the New England regiments. They did not acknowledge local civil authority. They did not acknowledge military justice when military justice was applied to one of their own. On two separate occasions in late August and early September, riflemen forced their way into the Prospect Hill guardhouse to release comrades who had been imprisoned for minor infractions. When an offender was sentenced to be whipped, a standard military punishment in the 18th century, used routinely in every army in Europe. The men of his company gathered, openly damned their officers, and threatened a riot until Colonel Thompson capitulated and pardoned the prisoner. Thompson's lack of disciplinary rigor was, by this point, well established. He was a competent commander in many ways. He had organized the Pennsylvania Rifle Battalion. He had led it at Lechmere Point with considerable skill. But Thompson, like most officers of the rifle companies, had been chosen for his marksmanship and his frontier reputation, not for his ability to maintain military discipline. He led men who had elected him, in effect, by their willingness to follow him. He could not afford to push them too hard, so he did not push them at all. The result was that by the end of the first week of September 1775, the rifle companies had become, in the assessment of senior Continental officers, the worst disciplined units in the Army. Possibly the worst disciplined units that had ever been brought together in an American army. The crisis was not approaching. The crisis had arrived. It had been arriving since August. The only question was how it would finally break. It broke on Sunday, September 10th, 1775. The sequence of events that morning is recorded in detail in the records of the subsequent court-martial. It moved with the speed of a fire in dry grass. Adjutant Lieutenant David Ziegler of Thompson's Pennsylvania Rifle Battalion arrested a sergeant. The charge was neglect of duty and murmuring. 18th century military language for failure to perform assigned tasks and for verbal insubordination. Both common charges, both ordinarily handled with a brief stay in the guardhouse and a fine. Ziegler ordered the sergeant secured in the Prospect Hill guardhouse. Routine procedure, standard discipline. It did not stay routine for long. Within minutes, a group of riflemen confronted Ziegler. They demanded the sergeant's release. They threatened, openly in front of an officer, to liberate him by force if Ziegler did not free him voluntarily. Ziegler, who appears to have been one of the few rifle company officers willing to enforce discipline at any cost, refused. He arrested the principal mutineer instead. Now there were two men in the guardhouse. Now the situation had moved from a single disciplinary case to an active confrontation between an officer and his men. Ziegler left the guardhouse to report the breakdown of order to Colonel Thompson. While Ziegler was reporting, a crowd of riflemen, exact numbers unrecorded, but enough to overwhelm whatever guards were at the building, broke open the guardhouse and freed the principal mutineer. They did not free the original sergeant. They freed the man Ziegler had arrested for trying to free the sergeant. The mutiny was now a mutiny against the arrest of the mutiny, which was itself an attempt to overturn the arrest of a sergeant whose original offense had been minor. This is the moment when American military discipline could have collapsed permanently. Colonel Thompson, hearing the report from Ziegler, moved fast. He and Lieutenant Colonel Edward Hand being a young Irish-born officer who would later become one of the most reliable rifle commanders of the war, pursued the crowd. They caught up with the freed prisoner. They recaptured him. They did not, however, return him to the Prospect Hill guardhouse, where they correctly assumed he would be freed again. They ordered him escorted to the main guard at Cambridge, several miles away, where the prisoner would be beyond the immediate reach of his comrades. This is where the mutiny became serious. Within 30 minutes of the prisoner being transferred to Cambridge, 32 men of Captain James Ross's Lancaster County Company loaded their rifles with live ammunition. Live ammunition, not parade powder, not blanks, real powder, real ball, the same loads they used against British soldiers. They swore, in the language preserved in the court-martial record, that by God they would go to the main guard and release the man or lose their lives. Then they started running toward Cambridge, armed with loaded rifles, to break their comrade out of the main guard of the Continental Army. The officers of the Rifle Battalion tried to stop them. The officers could not stop them. 32 armed men with loaded rifles, in open defiance of every chain of command in the Army, were now moving toward the main guard at Cambridge, with the announced intention of either freeing a prisoner from the Army's central guardhouse or dying in the attempt. If they had reached the main guard, if they had opened fire on the guard detail, if even one Continental soldier had died defending an arrested mutineer from the rifle companies, the Army would have torn itself apart. Other rifle companies might have joined. The New England regiments would have demanded retaliation. The fragile coalition that Washington had been holding together for 3 months would have shattered. Washington moved within minutes of receiving word. He reinforced the Cambridge Guard detail with 500 armed men, pulled from loyal regiments, ordered to surround the main guard with fixed bayonets and to fire if the mutineers attempted forced entry. Then Washington himself, accompanied by Major General Charles Lee and Major General Nathaniel Greene, rode out to intercept the mutineers on Prospect Hill. 3 of the most senior officers in the Continental Army riding personally into a confrontation with armed men of their own command, on a hillside near Cambridge on a Sunday morning, with the war hanging on what happened in the next 10 minutes. Washington reached them in a wooded area between Prospect Hill and the main guard. He confronted them directly. The exact words of his order have not survived, but the substance is recorded. He ordered them to ground their arms. They grounded their arms, every one of them. 32 armed riflemen in open mutiny against the Army that had recruited them and the commander who had ridden out to stop them, laid their loaded rifles on the ground at Washington's order. The most important sentence in the early history of the United States Army may have been that order. The most important silence may have been the silence that followed it, in which armed men chose to obey rather than to fire. Washington's authority, which had been theoretical, paper, granted by a Congress none of these men had voted for, exercised over an army that did not yet entirely exist, became real in that moment. The mutineers had a choice. They chose the Army. Washington was not finished. He ordered Captain George Nagle's loyal Berks County Rifle Company to surround the mutineers with loaded weapons, rifle company against rifle company. He then ordered elements of Colonel Daniel Hitchcock's 2nd Rhode Island Regiment and Colonel Moses Little's Massachusetts Regiment with fixed bayonets to surround the entire scene. The 32 mutineers were now surrounded by their own kind on the inside ring and by New England regulars with bayonets on the outside ring. There was no escape. The arrest was secure. Every one of the 32 was taken into custody. The next morning, September 11th, Washington stripped Thompson's battalion of all its special privileges. The rifle companies would no longer be exempt from camp duties. They would dig trenches. They would gather firewood. They would stand guard rotations like every other unit in the Army. They would, in other words, behave like soldiers. Or they would face consequences they had not yet imagined. The General Court-Martial convened on September 12th. The court considered the charges. The court considered the political reality. The court considered the fact that the southern colonies, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, were the source of the rifle companies, and that severe punishments handed down to Pennsylvania mutineers could alienate the southern delegations in Congress, could fracture the political coalition that was barely holding the war effort together. The sentences were extraordinarily lenient. Each of the 33 convicted mutineers, there were 33 by the time the final count came in, the original 32 plus one additional, was fined 20 shillings. The principal instigator, John Lechmere, received an additional 6 days of imprisonment. That was the punishment. 20 shillings, and for the ringleader, less than a week behind bars, for armed mutiny, with loaded weapons, against the Central Guard of the Continental Army in wartime. The leniency was a political decision, and it was the right one. Washington could not afford to execute riflemen in September 1775. He could not afford to whip them publicly. He could afford to enforce discipline, strip privileges, and make clear that any future incident would be handled less mercifully. And that is what he did. The mutiny was suppressed without bloodshed. The Army held. The chain of command, tested in the worst possible way, at the worst possible moment, had held. But the rifleman's reputation never recovered. General Artemus Ward, the senior New England officer in the Army before Washington's arrival, noted privately that Washington wished the riflemen had never come. General Charles Lee, the same Charles Lee who had ridden out with Washington to confront the mutineers, was less restrained. Lee openly cursed the riflemen. He said he wished them all inside Boston, fighting on the British side, where they could be the enemy's problem instead of the Army's. General John Thomas described the rifle companies as exceedingly vicious and unwilling for duty of any kind. Washington himself, writing to his brother Samuel, used a phrase that has come down through history with particular bite. "Many of the Pennsylvanians," he wrote, "know no more of a rifle than my horse." That last line is the most devastating thing any commander has ever said about his own elite troops. The men Congress had recruited as specialist marksmen, the men Washington had been counting on as the Army's professional corps, were, in their own commander's private estimation, mostly fraudulent. Many of them could barely use the weapon they had been hired to use. The myth had outrun the reality, even within the Army that was building the myth. But here is the harder truth, the one that took historians a long time to see. The myth still worked. The British still feared the riflemen. The shirt-tail men were still widow and orphan makers in London newspapers. The belles of Boston were still silent. None of the British knew about the Prospect Hill Mutiny. None of them knew that Washington had ridden out personally to face down his own men. None of them knew that the rifle companies were drunk, undisciplined, and full of men who did not really know how to shoot. The legend kept doing its work even as the reality crumbled. The contradiction at the heart of the rifle companies, that they were less than they appeared, but their appearance was their weapon, turned out to be exactly the thing that made them strategically useful. They did not have to be what the British feared. They only had to be feared. They had achieved that in August. They could ride on that fear for the rest of the war. And in the meantime, the discipline began to change. Slowly, painfully, with resistance at every step. On December 7, 1775, Private John Short of Colonel Theophilus Cotton's Massachusetts Regiment was tried by a general court-martial for theft and desertion. Short was sentenced to 39 lashes on his bare back and 2 years of imprisonment in the notorious Simsbury mines in Connecticut, an underground former copper mine used as a military prison, infamous for its conditions. The same day, Captain Peter Ingersoll was convicted of defaming Washington, fined £8, and immediately dismissed from the service. These were the punishments that ordinary Continental soldiers, New England soldiers, regular regiments received for serious offenses: 39 lashes, imprisonment, dismissal. The contrast with the 20-shilling fines handed to the Rifle Company mutineers 2 months earlier was glaring, and the senior command knew it was glaring, and the rifle companies were given to understand in unspoken ways that the leniency would not be extended a second time. 2 days later, on December 9th, 1775, the first court-martial composed of rifle officers convened. The accused were 2 men from Captain Moses Rawlings' Maryland Company and 1 from Captain Thomas Price's Maryland Company. The charges varied. The verdicts were guilty. The sentences were the same as for any New England soldier convicted of similar offenses. The men were tied to an apple tree in the hollow square formation that ensured the entire unit witnessed the punishment, and whipped on their bare backs. The whipping of those 3 men by their own officers, witnessed by their own comrades, marked something significant. The riflemen had been brought inside the system. They were now subject to the same discipline as the rest of the Army. The special privileges were gone. The exemptions were gone. The myth might still terrify the British, but inside the camps, the rifle companies were now just companies. Washington had won. Quietly, without bloodshed, through a combination of personal authority, political calculation, and the slow, grinding application of military justice over 3 months, he had broken the rifle company's independence and absorbed them into the Continental Army he was trying to build. It was one of the most important victories of his career, and almost nobody noticed it happen. By the winter of 1775, the British had begun to understand the riflemen. It had taken them most of the autumn. The early kills had stunned them. The shirt-tail myth had paralyzed them. The silence of the bells, that silence Bunker Hill had imposed and the riflemen had quietly extended, had broken something in the garrison's institutional confidence. But the British Army was an institution that had been losing wars for 2 centuries and learning from those losses. And the British officers in Boston were not stupid. They watched. They thought. They figured out what the rifle could do and, more importantly, what it could not do. The rifle's vulnerabilities were straightforward, and they were brutal. The first vulnerability was the rate of fire. A British regular fired 4 times in the time it took a rifleman to fire once. In a sustained firefight at moderate range, 50 to 100 yards, the British weight of fire was simply overwhelming. The rifleman might be more accurate per shot, but accuracy did not matter if the enemy could put 4 times as much lead into the air. By the end of any firefight, the rifleman would have been forced into a defensive crouch, unable to maintain his aimed slow fire, while volleys came in faster than he could reload. The second vulnerability was barrel fouling. 18th century black powder produced enormous quantities of carbon residue when it burned. In a smoothbore musket, the residue was largely irrelevant. The ball was loose. The windage absorbed the fouling. The gun could fire dozens of shots before cleaning. In a rifled barrel, the fouling collected in the spiral grooves. Within 10 or 15 shots, the grooves were coated. The patched ball became harder and harder to ram down, and the rate of fire dropped from 1 shot per minute to 1 shot every 2 or 3 minutes. In a prolonged engagement, a rifleman who did not have time to clean his barrel between volleys became, gradually, useless. The third vulnerability was the absence of the bayonet, and this was the one that destroyed riflemen in close combat. British officers like Colonel Robert Abercrombie developed countermeasures within months. The doctrine was simple. When facing American riflemen in open or semi-open country, regulars should ignore the initial long-range fire. They should accept the casualties from the first 1 or 2 volleys. Then they should close the distance rapidly, at a run if necessary, and execute a disciplined bayonet charge before the riflemen could reload. Without bayonets, without rapid reloading, without close-quarters weapons that could match 17 inches of triangular steel, the riflemen were finished the moment a British line got within 50 yards of them. Abercrombie was right. The doctrine worked. Riflemen were routinely overrun by bayonet charges throughout the war. The only way to prevent it was to support the rifle companies with smoothbore-equipped line infantry. Soldiers with bayonets who could hold off a British charge while the riflemen reloaded. Riflemen alone, on open ground, against regulars willing to absorb the initial fire and close fast, did not survive. Lechmere Point had worked to the extent it had worked, because the British were withdrawing toward their boats and could not turn to charge. Against organized, disciplined, charging regulars on open ground, the riflemen would have been slaughtered. But the British did more than just develop tactical countermeasures. They imported their own riflemen. The German states of Central Europe had been producing professional huntsmen, Jäger, for generations. These were forest hunters by trade, men employed by aristocratic landowners to manage game on noble estates. They knew the forest, they knew firearms, and they carried shorter, faster-loading rifles than the American long rifle. Weapons designed for hunting deer in dense German woodlands, with 28-inch barrels and large bores, capable of being loaded and fired more quickly than the slim, elegant Pennsylvania long arm. When Britain hired German mercenaries through the Hessian treaties, the same treaties that George merchants' smuggled intelligence had exposed, they hired Jaeger units along with the line infantry. By 1776 and 1777, German Jaeger companies were operating on American battlefields. They were armed with rifles, trained in open-order forest tactics, and entirely capable of meeting American riflemen on their own ground. The tactical asymmetry the Americans had enjoyed in 1775 was over. It had lasted less than a year in its purest form. After the British evacuation of Boston in March 1776, the riflemen never again held the kind of psychological monopoly they had held during the siege. They remained valuable. They remained dangerous. They would fight throughout the war, in every theater, with distinction at Saratoga and Cowpens and a dozen smaller engagements. Daniel Morgan, in particular, would become one of the great American commanders of the war. And his rifle corps would do extraordinary work in the Hudson Valley and the Carolinas. But the moment of pure terror, the autumn of 1775, when British officers were dying at unanswerable ranges and the funeral bells of Boston stayed silent and the shirt-tail men were widowmakers in London newspapers, was a moment. It passed. The British adapted. The Jaegers arrived. The war moved on. What did not pass was what the moment had taught. On March 17, 1776, the British evacuated Boston. They did not leave because of the riflemen. They left because Henry Knox, in one of the most extraordinary logistical achievements of the war, had hauled 59 artillery pieces overland from Fort Ticonderoga to Cambridge during the winter, and Washington had emplaced those guns on Dorchester Heights overnight. And the British position in the city had become untenable. The war moved south. The riflemen moved with it. The siege ended, not in a final battle, but in a quiet departure of British ships from Boston Harbor on a gray spring morning. The rifle companies went on to other campaigns. Daniel Morgan went on to Canada, was captured at Quebec, was exchanged, returned to the war, and eventually commanded the most famous American rifle corps of the entire Revolution. William Thompson was promoted, captured at Trois-Rivières, and exchanged. Edward Hand became a general. Michael Cresap died in October 1775 in New York. George Merchant, who had been paraded through England, eventually returned to obscurity. There is no record of his life after the war. William Simpson stayed in his grave outside Cambridge, the first man to die in the service of the new National Army that he had marched hundreds of miles to join. The Battle of Lechmere Point would be largely forgotten. The Prospect Hill Mutiny would survive only in court-martial records and the private letters of senior officers. The funeral bells of Boston, silent since Bunker Hill, would not toll for British officers throughout the 11 months of the siege. And after the British evacuation, when they finally rang again, they rang for weddings and christenings and the slow return of normal life to a city that had been at war with itself for nearly a year. But what the Riflemen had done at Boston, the experiment, the contradiction, the strange double existence of a unit that was simultaneously the Army's most valuable asset and its most dangerous internal threat, became part of the institutional memory of the United States Army in ways that took generations to fully express. They had demonstrated, for the first time in modern Western warfare, that a small unit of expert marksmen could exert influence on a campaign out of all proportion to its numbers. The ratio of casualties they inflicted to casualties they took, the disruption they imposed on an enemy's command structure, the psychological pressure they generated, the way they forced the British to develop entire new tactical doctrines just to neutralize them. All of this was new. All of this was the prototype for what would later become known as light infantry doctrine, special operations doctrine, and eventually sniper doctrine in the modern sense. The Byzantine generals at Dara had used trenches to make geometry into a weapon. The American riflemen at Boston used a different geometry, the geometry of distance, the geometry of which men in an army you choose to kill, the geometry of fear that spreads from one well-placed shot to 10,000 men 100 miles away. They proved that a shot at 200 yards could echo for 2.5 centuries. They also proved something harder. They proved that elite specialist units, raised separately from a regular army, granted special privileges, allowed to operate outside normal discipline, will, given enough time, tear apart the army they were meant to strengthen. The Prospect Hill Mutiny was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of a recruitment philosophy that treated specialists as exempt from the rules that applied to everyone else. Every modern military that has wrestled with the relationship between conventional and special operations forces has had to relearn that lesson. The Riflemen taught it first, and they proved something harder still. They proved that an army's reputation can outrun its capability, and that this gap, properly managed, is itself a strategic resource. Washington's order in 1776 that the entire Continental Army wear the hunting shirt was not a fashion decision. It was a recognition that the British would believe what the Riflemen had made them believe, and that belief could be exploited far beyond the men who had originally generated it. The myth, once built, could be shared. Every man in a hunting shirt became a potential rifleman in the British imagination. The cost of building that myth was paid by Morgan and Thompson and Cresap and the men who died at Ploughed Hill and Lechmere Point. The benefits would be drawn down by every American soldier for the next 6 years of war. The siege ended. The Riflemen left. The funeral bells of Boston were eventually rung again, for civilian funerals, for weddings, for the slow return of normal life to a city that had been at war with itself for 11 months. The fields outside Cambridge where William Simpson had bled out are now suburbs. The hill where Washington faced down his armed mutineers is a residential street. There is no monument at Lechmere Point. There is no marker at Plowed Hill. The morass that the Pennsylvania Rifle Battalion waded through in November 1775 was drained and filled in the 19th century. You could walk over the spot today and not know. But somewhere, in every military academy, in every doctrinal manual, in every conversation about how small units can shape large wars, the riflemen at Boston are still doing their work. Don't fight the battle your enemy expects. Choose your range. Choose your targets. Let your enemy believe you are worse than you are, then become exactly that. And remember, always remember, that the most dangerous men in your army may also be the ones you cannot afford to discipline the way you discipline everyone else. And that the gap between what you need and what you can control is the real problem of war, not the gap between you and the enemy. 20,000 colonial militia could not break a British garrison of 3,000 regulars in 11 months of close siege. 1,500 frontier hunters in 3 months broke the garrison's belief that it could survive in America. The siege ended without a major battle. The myth did not. A weapon that could kill at 300 yards, a weapon that was useless at 30, a unit that nearly destroyed the army that recruited it, a myth that helped that army win a war. The shirt-tail men, the cursed twisted guns, the most fatal widow and orphan makers in the world. They were less than the legend said. They were more than their commander wanted. They were the contradiction at the founding of the United States Army. And they have been the contradiction in every American light infantry tradition since. Sometimes, the most important shot in a war is the one that does not kill anyone. Sometimes, the most important soldiers are the ones the Army cannot quite figure out what to do with. And sometimes, the impossible thing about a frontier hunter with a handmade rifle on a Massachusetts hillside in August of 1775 is not what he can do at 200 yards, but what an entire empire begins to believe about him and about the country that sent him. That belief, more than any single shot, was what they brought to Boston. That belief was what they left behind.